A black lawyer returning from a high-profile case steps into the airport. Exhausted but relieved to be heading home. But within moments, everything shifts. A TSA agent pulls him aside for a random check. Though no one else in line is stopped, the pat-down turns invasive. The questions veer personal. And soon, he's standing there humiliated, his belongings scattered while strangers look on. What happens next? 7 minutes later, that agent is escorted out in front of the entire terminal. The fallout? No one expected it. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, hit that subscribe button for more stories that matter. Nia Warren stepped into the airport, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The morning light poured through the tall windows, illuminating the terminal in a sterile glow. She moved with a quiet confidence, her black tailored blazer fitting like a second skin, and a silk scarf crimson, vibrant looped neatly around her neck. The subtle elegance wasn't meant to impress. It wasn't armor. It was habit. Airports had always fascinated Nia. They were places of transition, where people's lives intersected for brief moments before scattering like dust in the wind. But no matter how far she had come, she knew there were always thresholds she wasn't expected to cross. Today would be no different. She approached the check-in counter, her first-class ticket resting delicately between her fingers. The airline staff greeted the passengers ahead of her with bright smiles and cheerful efficiency. Yet as Nia stepped forward, the warmth faded. It was subtle, like the dimming of lights before a storm. "Good morning," Nia said, her voice soft but deliberate as she placed the ticket on the counter. The young woman behind the desk, Maddie, according to her name tag, straightened her posture but couldn't quite conceal the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. The pause was brief but loud in the way silence often is. "First class?" Maddie asked, glancing down at the ticket and then back at Nia, as if trying to reconcile the two. "Yes," Nia replied. She offered no further explanation. Maddie's lips twitched into a forced smile. "Let me just check something." She turned slightly, holding the ticket up unnecessarily high, her voice lowering but still loud enough for Nia to hear. "Hey Bryce, can you look at this for a second?" Bryce, the tall man with a buzz cut at the next counter, glanced over, his eyes narrowing with interest. He chuckled as he approached, taking the ticket from Maddie's hand and holding it to the light as if it were counterfeit. "Never hurts to double-check," he said, smirking. Nia remained silent, her gaze fixed firmly on Bryce. She had seen this dance before, performed too many times in boardrooms, hotel lobbies, luxury stores. The unspoken question, "Who let her in here?" The line behind her began to shift, the subtle weight of impatience pressing at her back. A man in a navy blazer behind her cleared his throat pointedly. Finally, Bryce handed the ticket back with a dismissive shrug. "Guess she's good to go." "Thank you," Nia said, her voice even, betraying nothing. She stepped aside, rolling her suitcase toward the luggage drop-off. The leather handle felt cool under her grip, but her knuckles whitened. She forced herself to relax. At the conveyor belt, an older man in a rumpled uniform grabbed her suitcase without acknowledgement. The bag, sleek black with gold trim, stood out among the dull grays and blues around it. With little effort, the man flung it onto the belt. It wobbled precariously before landing hard on its side. A smaller carry-on bag tumbled off, skidding slightly across the floor. Nia stepped forward. "Could you handle that more carefully, please?" The man barely looked at her. "It's just luggage," he muttered, scooping the bag up and tossing it onto the belt with the same indifference. "Just luggage." Nia inhaled deeply, words she had learned to swallow settling like stones in her throat. "Thank you," she said, stepping back. As she walked toward the gate, she glanced over her shoulder. Maddie and Bryce were leaning in close, laughing softly. One of them looked up just as Nia caught their gaze. There was no embarrassment, only the smugness of someone convinced they had won some small, unspoken game. Nia kept walking. The concourse stretched long and bright ahead of her, but the space felt narrower with each step. She passed other travelers, businessmen in tailored suits, families with small children in tow. She knew she belonged there as much as anyone else, but belonging had rarely ever been the point. Near the boarding gate, Nia paused at a small cafe, ordering a black coffee she didn't particularly want. She sipped it slowly, letting the heat of the cup warm her palms. From her seat, she watched as Phil, the gate agent, greeted passengers with mechanical efficiency. When she stepped forward, his eyes flicked up, pausing for a breath longer than necessary. "May I see your ticket?" he asked. Even though she had already shown it once before. Nia held it out. Phil examined it as if inspecting fine print. The scanner beeped green, yet he hesitated, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "First class." "Huh?" His eyes skimmed over her, lingering on the details that weren't printed on the ticket. "Must be a special occasion." Nia met his gaze, unblinking. "Every occasion is special," she replied. Phil's expression didn't shift. He waved her through with an exaggerated motion. "Enjoy your flight." As she stepped into the jet bridge, Nia felt the heat rising beneath her skin. She had spent years navigating spaces like this, balancing on a tightrope stretched between dignity and defiance. Each encounter alone was small, almost trivial but strung together. They formed a web that clung to her like a second skin. But not today. Today, she wasn't just another passenger. Nia brushed her fingers over the phone in her pocket. The temptation to call someone lingering on the edges of her mind. Not yet. She smiled faintly to herself. Justice was patient, so was she. The gate area hummed with quiet activity, passengers scrolling through phones, checking watches, adjusting bags. Conversations rose and fell in waves. None loud enough to disturb the calm, yet loud enough to remind Nia Warren that silence here was a luxury afforded to others. Nia stood near the window, gazing out at the tarmac. Her suitcase was among the others, vanishing beneath the belly of the plane. She wondered if the man who had tossed it so carelessly had thought about her since. Likely not. For him, it was just another bag. For her, it was another small scar, one that might not bleed but still ached in the quiet moments. As she turned back toward the gate, her eyes caught the movement of the crew assembling nearby. A cluster of flight attendants in crisp uniforms spoke in low murmurs, exchanging jokes that elicited polite, restrained laughter. Their posture straightened as the pilot appeared, a middle-aged man with silver at his temples, walking with the self-assured air of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. One of the flight attendants, Claire, broke away from the group and approached the gate desk. Her eyes skimmed over the passengers as if assessing them, and for a brief moment, they landed on Nia. Claire's smile thinned, not unfriendly, but restrained, like a performer adjusting mid-act when the wrong audience enters the room. Nia held the gaze just long enough for Claire to look away. She wasn't sure if it was intentional. This small flicker of discomfort people showed around her. That was the trouble with such things, so often it wasn't about what was said. But what wasn't? The half-second delay in acknowledgement, the absent warmth, the subtle question lingering in the space between glances. "Do you belong here?" And the answer was always unspoken but undeniable. Nia shifted her weight and approached the boarding line as the first-class call was announced. She wasn't eager to sit down, but standing there any longer felt like conceding ground she had no intention of surrendering. "Miss?" She looked up to find Phil, the gate agent, watching her. His eyes scanned her ticket as if he had forgotten she had already handed it to him minutes before. "Nia Warren," she said simply. Phil's lips pressed into a tight line, and he gave a small nod. "Right, of course." Nia stepped forward, but before she could pass, Claire intercepted her. "Ma'am, can I see your ticket one more time?" Claire's voice was polite, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Nia didn't hesitate. She held the ticket out calmly, forcing herself to breathe evenly as Claire glanced over it. Claire's eyes flicked between the ticket and Nia, searching for something in error. A misstep, some crack in the facade that might reveal Nia's presence here as some sort of mistake. "You're in seat 2A," Claire confirmed after a long pause, her tone brightening with practiced ease. "Just wanted to double-check." The small offense floated between them, unacknowledged but very real. "Of course," Nia replied, tucking the ticket back into her bag. As she walked down the jet bridge, she felt the heat of Claire's gaze lingering behind her. It wasn't hatred. No, hatred would have been more honest. This was something else, something softer but no less damaging, a casual disbelief wrapped in the thin veil of professionalism. Inside the aircraft, the cabin was cool and quiet, yet somehow the walls felt closer. The rows of plush seats, arranged in careful symmetry, seemed to breathe easier without her presence. Nia slid into her seat, resting her bag by her feet. Across the aisle, a man in his late 50s adjusted his suit jacket. His eyes flicked toward her, briefly polite but curious. "Traveling for business?" he asked, his voice light but probing. Nia met his gaze with a calm that masked the familiar frustration simmering beneath the surface. "Yes," she replied, offering nothing more. The man smiled faintly, but his eyes lingered a beat too long, as if the simplicity of her answer wasn't quite enough to satisfy his curiosity. Before he could press further, Claire returned, hovering in the aisle. "Would you like anything before takeoff, ma'am?" she asked, but the question felt mechanical, as if she was going through motions required of her. "Water, please," Nia said, her voice clipped. Claire returned moments later, setting the glass on the tray table without a word. The exchange was brief but heavy, like the shifting of tectonic plates beneath seemingly calm waters. Nia sipped her water slowly, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the sky stretched wide and endless. But even at this altitude, the weight of the ground below still clung to her. Passengers trickled in, filling the cabin row by row. Laughter echoed from the back of the plane, mingling with the rustle of boarding passes and the shuffle of bags. But in first class, the quiet was thicker. Nia closed her eyes, willing herself to forget the whispers, the glances, the unchecked assumptions. It was a fight she had grown weary of, but one she could not abandon. Not today. Not ever. The hum of the engines was a low, steady throb beneath the quiet movements of the crew. Nia Warren settled into her seat as the last few passengers boarded, their footsteps and soft chatter filling the cabin like distant rain. The air in first class was crisp, cool, a deliberate comfort designed to remind its occupants that they had paid for something the rest of the plane could only glimpse from behind the curtain. But for Nia, the luxury was tempered by something else. Claire passed by her seat, her eyes flicking to Nia's tray table where the half-empty glass of water sat. It wasn't the glance itself, but the absence of the small courtesies, no offer to refill, no polite inquiry. It was the kind of thing you noticed when it wasn't there. The man across the aisle, the one with the tailored suit and silver hair, caught Nia's eye and smiled faintly, as if they shared some unspoken understanding. But Nia knew better. He wasn't smiling with her. He was smiling at her. There was a difference. "First time flying with this airline?" he asked, leaning slightly toward her. Nia shifted, crossing one leg over the other. "No," she said plainly. "Oh," he said, the curiosity lingering in his tone like a hand that hovers just before touching. "I thought I might have seen you before. I fly often for work." Nia returned to her book without offering him a foothold in the conversation. But she could feel his gaze linger a second longer before he turned back to his tablet. Across the cabin, Rick, the same flight attendant who had dismissed her concern about her luggage earlier, knelt beside another passenger. A middle-aged woman with short, blonde hair was gesturing toward the overhead bin, her voice tinged with mild frustration. Rick's face softened, his stance patient as he reached up, gently adjusting her bags. Nia watched the scene unfold, noting the way his entire demeanor shifted. There was warmth in his tone, ease in his body language. It wasn't lost on her that he had spoken to her as though time were currency, and she was always a few cents short. Rick glanced in her direction as he straightened. Their eyes met, but his didn't linger. He moved on without acknowledgement. "It's nothing," she told herself. "Let it go." But small things had a way of piling up. The plane rolled slowly away from the gate, and the safety video played on the screens overhead. Nia barely watched. She knew the routine by heart. Not because she flew often, but because routine ritual was how people like her stayed safe in places where they weren't always welcome. She remembered her father telling her once, as they sat on a bench outside their neighborhood grocery store, "The thing about respect is you don't ask for it. You carry yourself like you already have it. If they can't see it, that's their problem." But even then, she had known that wasn't the whole truth. The plane lifted off, pressing her back into the seat. By the time the cabin lights dimmed, the world outside the window had faded into a vast stretch of clouds, endless and pale. Nia closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull her into a fragile quiet. She woke to the sound of hushed voices. "Ma'am?" Claire's voice was soft but tight with forced politeness. Nia opened her eyes, blinking against the faint glow of the cabin. Claire stood beside her, holding a tray with a small meal, something that barely passed for dinner but was dressed up on porcelain to make it seem more than it was. "We're starting the meal service," Claire said. "Would you like chicken or pasta?" Nia sat up slightly, smoothing the front of her blazer. "Pasta, please." Claire placed the tray down carefully, but not without a glance at the passenger beside Nia, a middle-aged man scrolling through his phone. Oblivious to the exchange. It was subtle, the way Claire's eyes flicked to him, as if to remind herself that he belonged there. And Nia wondered if, in Claire's mind, she was the anomaly in this quiet, plush cabin. The man beside her, Gregory, according to his luggage tag, sighed loudly and removed his earbuds. Claire's attention shifted to him immediately. "Mr. Sanders, can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice suddenly warmer, softer, like rain easing into the earth. Gregory smiled. "I'm fine for now, thanks. Maybe a coffee in a bit." "Of course," Claire replied, practically beaming as she retreated down the aisle. Nia glanced at her own tray, the same meal, the same drink, yet somehow, the taste was already different. It was never about the service itself. It was about how it was given, how it was withheld. Gregory shifted beside her, glancing briefly at her tray. "I'll admit, I thought first class was overrated the first time I flew," he said, breaking the silence between them. "But it grows on you, doesn't it?" Nia smiled faintly but didn't respond. "Nice to see more diversity up here these days," he added casually, as if the words were meant to flatter. The smile faded from Nia's lips. She set her fork down carefully, leveling Gregory with a look that was calm but cold. "I didn't realize diversity was something we needed to grow accustomed to," she said, her voice like glass, thin but sharp at the edges. Gregory blinked, clearly unprepared for a response. He laughed awkwardly, as if to erase the weight of what had just passed between them. "Ah, no offense meant," he said. "None taken," Nia replied, though the lie tasted bitter. Gregory shifted uncomfortably, returning to his phone, and Nia returned to her meal, though her appetite had long vanished. "It's nothing," she thought again, but she knew better. Small things accumulate, like dust in the corners of rooms no one bothers to clean. And one day, they become impossible to ignore. The flight pressed forward, a long thread stretching across the sky, tying Nia Warren to a destination that felt further away than the miles would suggest. The quiet hum of the engine seemed louder now, filling the space between moments that left too much room for thought. Gregory, the man beside her, had retreated into the glow of his phone, scrolling with the ease of someone who had never felt out of place. Nia envied the simplicity of his existence, not because he deserved it more, but because he had never been required to explain it. Across the aisle, Claire moved with her usual efficiency, but Nia caught the way her eyes softened when addressing the other passengers. The smile that hovered on Claire's lips never quite seemed to find its way to Nia. It was a familiar game, one Nia had learned to play without realizing she was playing. But she had long understood the unspoken rule: you could either be graceful or angry, but never both. Grace was tolerated, anger was punished. As the plane began to settle into the midpoint of the flight, Rick returned, pushing the drink cart down the aisle. The clink of glasses and ice mingled with murmured requests: gin and tonic, bourbon, sparkling water. When Rick arrived at Nia's row, he didn't pause. "Something for you?" he asked Gregory, skipping right over her without so much as a glance. Gregory leaned back, barely noticing the omission. "Scotch." "Neat." Rick poured the drink smoothly, placing it on Gregory's tray with the precision of a practiced hand. Only then did he turn to Nia, the brief flicker of acknowledgement arriving too late, as though she were an afterthought. "And for you?" Rick asked, his voice flat. "Red wine," Nia said, her eyes steady on his. Rick nodded, filling the glass with a measured hand. When he set it down, the edge of the glass grazed the farthest corner of the tray, closer to tipping than resting. "Thank you," Nia said softly, not bothering to adjust it right away. Rick moved on without reply. Gregory glanced at her, brows lifting in faint curiosity. "Huh," he said with the air of someone who thought they were piecing together a puzzle. Nia didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. Later, when the cabin lights dimmed and the hush of sleeping passengers filled the space, Nia remained awake. The window beside her framed the endless dark, punctuated by faint stars too distant to matter. She shifted in her seat, the soft leather suddenly feeling stiff against her back. Sleep wouldn't come. Rising quietly, she moved down the aisle toward the lavatory, stepping carefully over the edge of slumbering bodies tucked beneath cashmere blankets. At the front of the cabin, Rick stood with Claire near the galley, their conversation low but laced with something sharper than casual talk. Claire's eyes darted toward Nia as she approached, but Rick kept speaking, his voice carrying just enough for her to hear. "I'm just saying," Rick muttered. "Sometimes you can tell. You know the type. It's written all over them." Claire made a noise that was halfway between agreement and discomfort. Nia paused just long enough to let the weight of their words find her. And yet, when she stepped into view, neither of them shifted. They didn't even pretend to lower their voices. Rick met her gaze briefly before leaning back against the galley wall. "Ma'am," he said, the title stretched thin by condescension. Nia nodded, brushing past them without breaking stride. Inside the lavatory, the light above the mirror buzzed faintly. She stood there for a long moment, staring at her reflection. Her father's voice echoed in her mind again. "You don't ask for respect." But even he hadn't prepared her for this. She ran cold water over her hands, as if washing away something invisible. When she stepped back into the aisle, Rick and Claire had vanished, leaving only the empty galley behind. As Nia returned to her seat, Gregory shifted, blinking sleep from his eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice still thick with lingering dreams. Nia settled in without looking at him. Fine. But it wasn't fine. The thing about these moments, the skipped drinks, the unnecessary ticket checks, the quiet dismissals, was that they were never loud. Never loud enough to be called out directly. They lived in the spaces between words, wrapped in smiles that weren't quite smiles, in gestures too small to be named but too sharp to be ignored. Gregory yawned, stretching his arms. "I'm telling you," he said with the careless ease of someone who felt entitled to advice. "You shouldn't take these things so personally. Sometimes people are just thoughtless." Nia turned to him slowly, meeting his gaze with a stillness that made him falter. "Thoughtless is a luxury," she said. "It assumes there's nothing to lose." Gregory blinked, as if the meaning of her words required time to land. He offered a small nod but said nothing more. Nia turned back toward the window, watching the distant horizon begin to soften with the first hint of dawn. The world below remained dark, but somewhere ahead, light was waiting. The cabin was suspended in darkness, save for the faint glow of reading lights that dotted the rows like distant stars. Nia Warren sat in the quiet, the glass of wine on her tray now untouched. The taste soured not by the drink itself but by the hand that had poured it. The man beside her, Gregory, had drifted back to sleep, his breathing steady, shoulders rising and falling with the ease of someone who had long been comfortable in spaces like this. His seat reclined, legs stretched just far enough into Nia's side of the row to remind her that even in first class, space was negotiable, and the negotiation rarely favored her. Out the window, the world lay beneath them, shrouded in velvet black. The plane's altitude created an illusion of distance, of separation from whatever mess awaited on the ground. But Nia knew better. High altitudes didn't dissolve the weight of what followed her. They only offered a clearer view of the storms below. A soft chime echoed overhead. The captain's voice, low and steady, announced mild turbulence ahead. The plane trembled slightly, but not enough to rouse most passengers. Nia felt it, though the slight unsteadiness not of the aircraft but of herself. She wasn't afraid of flying. She had long grown accustomed to the precarious balance of trust that came with surrendering control. No, the turbulence wasn't what unsettled her. It was the voice she couldn't shake, the one that lingered after overhearing Rick and Claire's exchange by the galley. "You know the type." That was the trouble with the world Nia occupied. To them, she was always a type. Always more of an idea than a person. A concept to be handled, managed, watched. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the ease with which it was delivered. The casual confidence that there would be no consequence for their words. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. A faint rustle stirred her. Gregory had woken again, adjusting his blanket with one hand while peering toward the aisle. Nia followed his gaze. Rick had returned, weaving quietly between the rows, collecting empty glasses and crumpled napkins. When he reached Nia's row, he hesitated just briefly, barely noticeable, except to someone trained to see the slight pause of hesitation. Gregory handed over his empty glass. Murmuring a quiet thanks, Rick took it with a nod. But when he glanced at Nia's tray, he didn't speak. Her glass remained untouched, the wine now reflecting faint ripples from the plane's subtle movements. "Finished with this, ma'am?" Rick asked, the last word barely audible. Nia met his gaze carefully. "Not yet." Rick's hand hovered just long enough to make his impatience known before he moved on. Gregory watched the interaction with quiet interest. "Seems like you're making a point," he said once Rick had moved a few rows down. Nia turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Wouldn't have to if everyone else was paying attention." Gregory offered a small chuckle, though it was tinged with discomfort. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said, but the words felt weightless even as he spoke them. "It's always nothing to the people who don't have to live with it." Nia replied softly, her gaze fixed forward. Gregory opened his mouth as if to respond, but something in Nia's expression, something still, yet sharp, made him reconsider. Later, when the cabin dimmed further for the overnight portion of the flight, Nia rose to stretch her legs. She made her way toward the back of the plane, her footsteps light against the carpeted floor. Past the curtain separating first class from coach, the air felt different, less curated, more real. Families dozed with children curled up against their sides. College students leaned against windows, earbuds dangling, heads bobbing gently with the rhythm of the flight. Here, no one paid her much attention. But when she returned to her seat, she found Claire waiting by her row, lips pressed tight as if sealing something she'd rather not say aloud. "Ma'am," Claire began, "I wanted to make sure everything's all right. I noticed earlier," she trailed off, the words lingering like a half-formed apology that couldn't find its footing. Nia let the silence stretch between them, long enough for Claire to shift uncomfortably. "I'm fine," Nia said finally, though her tone suggested otherwise. Claire nodded quickly, seizing the moment of reprieve. "Of course, just let us know if you need anything." And just like that, Claire disappeared down the aisle, eager to return to the ease of passengers who required less from her. Gregory stirred beside her. "You could report it," he said quietly, not meeting her gaze. "I could," Nia replied, but she wouldn't, because that was the unspoken rule, wasn't it? Reporting these things meant handing over more than just a complaint. It meant surrendering pieces of herself, explaining the invisible bruises, justifying why the small cuts mattered when no one else seemed to bleed. It meant giving them the power to decide if her experience was valid. Nia leaned back against her seat, letting the thought pass like distant thunder. Tomorrow, she would step off this plane. And tomorrow, they would remember her not for who she was, but for the way she had quietly insisted on existing in a place that hadn't been made for her. And perhaps that, for now, was enough. The plane drifted through the sky like a ghost, its passengers suspended somewhere between yesterday and tomorrow. The hum of the engines had settled into the kind of rhythm that made time feel irrelevant, stretching and contracting as though the air itself conspired to keep Nia Warren in this fragile stillness. Gregory had returned to his cocoon of sleep, his breathing deep and untroubled. The blanket draped over his lap had begun to slip, but he hadn't noticed. Nia thought about adjusting it for him but decided against it. Across the aisle, Claire lingered near the galley, fussing over cups and napkins as though rearranging them might erase the residue of earlier interactions. Nia watched her for a moment, noting how Claire's hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. There was a weariness in Claire's movements that Nia recognized, the weariness of someone who wanted to do right but feared the cost of trying. It wasn't the Claires of the world that made Nia angry. It was the Ricks. Rick, who now sat casually at the front of the cabin, legs crossed, flipping through a glossy magazine as though the flight were just another day at the office. He exuded the kind of indifference that people carried when they had spent too long in positions of power. However small, Nia could feel it radiating off him, the belief that whatever passed between them earlier had already dissolved into the air. Forgotten. But she hadn't forgotten. Her father used to tell her, "Some people will convince you that forgetting is forgiveness. Don't let them." She let the words sit with her as the cabin lights flickered slightly, the signal that they were beginning their descent. Claire reappeared, moving from row to row with the practiced efficiency of someone who needed the flight to end as much as the passengers did. As Claire approached Nia's seat, the polite mask slipped back into place. "Seat belt fastened?" she asked, her tone clipped but professional. Nia nodded, but just before Claire turned to leave, Nia's voice anchored her in place. "Claire," Nia said softly. Claire stiffened. She turned slowly, her eyes cautious. "Yes?" Nia tilted her head slightly. Studying her. "What's harder for you, seeing it happen or pretending you didn't?" Claire's eyes widened just enough to betray her. But she recovered quickly. She forced a tight smile. "I'm not sure what you mean," Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Nia held her gaze for a long moment, allowing the silence to press between them. "Of course you do," Nia said, and then she let Claire walk away. The city lights stretched below them as the plane dipped lower, the vast expanse of night flickering with life. Nia watched as the horizon tilted, pulling her back down to the reality waiting beneath the clouds. As the wheels touched the tarmac, a ripple of relief passed through the cabin. The quiet hum of conversation resumed, and the stillness shattered, piece by piece. Gregory stirred, rubbing his eyes as the plane taxied toward the gate. "Looks like we made it," he said, offering a sleepy smile as if they had endured the same journey. But Nia knew better. The turbulence he slept through was not the same turbulence she had felt. Passengers gathered their bags, filling the aisles with the shuffle of jackets and hurried footsteps. Nia remained seated, watching as Rick and Claire stood near the exit, bidding farewell to passengers with bright, performative smiles. When Nia finally rose, she took her time, allowing the flow of people to thin until only a few stragglers remained. As she approached the exit, Rick's eyes met hers briefly. But there was no acknowledgement, no apology. He had already moved on. "Thank you for flying with us," Claire said, her voice softer than before. But the tension lingered in her eyes. Nia nodded. "Take care, Claire." Rick glanced sideways at them, his expression unreadable, but something in the way Nia spoke seemed to unnerve him. "Good." She stepped onto the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the metal floor, echoing softly as she walked away. Outside the terminal, the air felt heavier, thicker with the weight of the world she had re-entered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from her assistant. "They're waiting in the boardroom." Nia smiled faintly, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Yes, they were waiting, and so was she, because the fight was far from over. The terminal stretched wide and sterile, the fluorescent lights humming faintly as Nia Warren walked toward baggage claim. The crowd that had shared the flight with her dispersed quickly, swallowed by connecting corridors and distant voices calling for final boarding. Nia moved slower, the echo of her heels on the polished floor trailing behind her like a shadow that refused to part ways. She felt it the moment she approached the carousel. The air thickened, not from the press of bodies but from the presence of three familiar figures stationed nearby: Rick, Claire, and a man in a navy suit who bore the quiet weight of middle management. They stood together, Rick speaking with his hands in small, sharp gestures, the kind of performance men give when they know the stage is theirs. Claire listened, arms folded, her eyes darting nervously toward the conveyor belt. When she caught sight of Nia approaching, her posture straightened, but she didn't speak. Rick, however, caught the shift. He turned, his expression cooling the moment their eyes met. Nia stopped just short of the carousel, letting the weight of the moment stretch between them. "Ma'am," Rick said, with the false politeness of someone addressing a stranger for the first time. His voice carried just loud enough for Claire and the manager to hear. "Is there something I can help you with?" Nia's gaze didn't waver. "I'll let you know if there is." She stepped forward, watching as bags began to spill onto the carousel, each one tumbling with a casual carelessness that mirrored Rick's indifference. Her suitcase appeared black with gold trim, distinctive against the sea of ordinary. She reached for it, but Rick beat her to it, lifting the handle with the same ease he had when throwing it onto the cart hours earlier. "Here you go," he said, offering it as if it were an act of generosity. His grip lingered half a second too long. Nia accepted the bag, her eyes narrowing just enough to acknowledge the game he was playing. "Thank you," she said, with a calm that Rick mistook for surrender. She turned to leave, but the navy-suited manager finally spoke. "Ms. Warren?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to step in. Nia paused but didn't turn around immediately. "Yes?" The manager cleared his throat, stepping forward as though his proximity might soften the edges of the conversation. "I understand there may have been a misunderstanding during the flight. He began, each word carefully selected to avoid the wrong impression. If there's anything you'd like to discuss, I'd be happy to assist you. Nia finally turned, her eyes settling on him with quiet precision. Misunderstanding, she repeated, tasting the word as if testing it for poison. The manager's smile tightened, the kind men wore when they knew they were standing on fragile ground. Rick shifted beside him, arms now crossed, watching the exchange with thinly veiled amusement. Claire stood further back, her silence growing heavier by the second. It's just that we value feedback. The manager continued, his tone softening, and we want to ensure your experience was appropriate. Appropriate. Another word stripped of meaning the moment it left his mouth. Nia let the silence grow, the weight of the moment pressing down on all three of them. I'm sure you do, she said finally, but I don't recall asking for assistance. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but Nia had already turned away, her suitcase gliding smoothly behind her. Claire took a half step forward, as if she might say something, but the words never came. Nia stepped outside into the cool night air. The city stretched before her, the lights blinking softly in the distance like quiet reminders of the world she had fought to belong to. Her phone buzzed. Boardroom in 30. They're all here. Nia smiled faintly, tucking the phone into her pocket. This was the part they never saw, the part after the small battles. After the polite dismissals and careful insults. The part where she stepped into rooms they never expected her to enter. Justice, she had learned, rarely arrived in grand gestures. It often came quietly, in the form of steady, unshaken steps. Tonight, those steps led her forward, one after another, into the kind of victory that left no room for misunderstanding. The boardroom was quiet, save for the low hum of conversation threading between the executives seated along the polished oak table. The room stretched wide, encased in glass, allowing the city skyline to pour in like an uninvited guest. The lights beyond flickered softly, indifferent to the weight pressing down inside. Nia Warren entered without announcement, the click of her heels cutting clean through the murmur of voices. Heads turned, not because she demanded attention but because she carried something into the room that couldn't be ignored. She walked with the kind of poise that made men sit straighter and glance at one another, as if silently negotiating how to position themselves in her presence. At the head of the table sat Michael Hayes, CEO of the airline, his graying hair neatly combed, his suit impeccable. He smiled as she approached, not the smile of friendship, but the kind of polished gesture that men in power wore like armor. Nia, he greeted, rising slightly from his chair. Thank you for joining us. She met his outstretched hand, shaking it firmly. I wasn't aware this was optional, she replied, her voice even. A ripple of faint chuckles drifted down the table, though no one laughed too hard. Michael gestured to the seat directly across from him. Please, sit. Nia did, setting her bag gently beside the chair, though she felt every gaze anchored to her like weight on her shoulders. She was not the first black woman to sit at this table, but she was one of the few who did so without lowering her gaze, without offering smallness in exchange for comfort. Michael folded his hands, his elbows resting lightly on the table's edge. I believe there was some turbulence during your flight, he said carefully. Turbulence. Nia let the word hang there, suspended between them. There was, she said, leaning back in her chair, but not the kind that makes the plane shake. A few seats down, a younger executive shifted uncomfortably. Nia caught the slight flicker of his gaze, the way he glanced at Michael as if hoping for a cue on how to react. Michael nodded, smoothing his tie. I see. His eyes narrowed just slightly, as if measuring her. I trust the crew handled it appropriately? No, Nia said plainly. The room stiffened. Michael's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened at the edges. I'm sorry to hear that. If there's any specific feedback you'd like to offer. Feedback? Nia interrupted, her voice calm but cutting. She let the words sink in, tasting it as if it were something bitter. Michael paused. I wasn't under the impression that I needed to offer feedback, she continued, her eyes locking with his. I thought I came here to discuss accountability. The air shifted. Across the room, Claire sat quietly along the far wall, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken since Nia arrived, but her presence was as loud as any voice in the room. Nia let her gaze pass over Rick, standing near the corner like an afterthought. He hadn't expected to be called in, but there he was, posture stiff, pretending not to notice that Nia's eyes found him. "I know how these conversations tend to go," Nia said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "We speak in circles, words like misunderstanding and oversight get tossed around until the weight of what happened dissolves into thin air. And by the end of it, everyone leaves feeling satisfied that the issue has been addressed." She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table. "But let me be clear," she said, lowering her voice just enough to draw every eye closer. "I'm not interested in being part of a conversation that ends with apologies and shrugs." Rick shifted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I boarded that flight as a passenger. But I'm sitting at this table as someone with power," Nia continued, letting the words land with the weight they deserved. "And I don't intend to let that power be dismissed." Michael's smile thinned, but he nodded. "Of course," he said, his voice measured. "Accountability is important to us. And rest assured, we take these matters seriously." Nia's gaze sharpened. "Then act like it." The room fell still. Claire, for the first time, raised her head slightly, her eyes flicking nervously between Nia and Michael. Nia didn't break eye contact. "You want feedback?" Nia said, tilting her head. "Here it is. Your crew made a decision the moment I stepped into that airport. They decided who I was and where I didn't belong. And every step from check-in to landing was a reminder that no matter how much I paid for that seat, I was still being asked to prove I deserved it." She let the words settle, watching as the weight of them tightened Michael's jaw. "This isn't about training," Nia added. "It's about culture. And culture doesn't change because of memos or one-off seminars." Michael's fingers drummed lightly against the table. "So what do you propose?" he asked. Nia allowed herself a small smile, just enough for him to know that she had already thought this through. "You already know," she replied. His gaze held hers for a long moment. And then slowly, he nodded. "Consider it done," Michael said finally, though the words felt heavier than he had anticipated. Rick's eyes widened slightly, as if only now realizing that the ground beneath him had shifted. As the meeting wrapped, executives rose one by one, offering polite nods and faint smiles. But Nia didn't rush. She lingered just long enough to let Michael know that she hadn't simply come to be heard, she had come to be remembered. And as she left the boardroom, stepping once more into the glow of the city beyond the glass, Nia Warren carried the quiet certainty of something Rick and Claire would come to understand all too well. The room might forget the details of what was said, but it would not forget her.